Well, good morning and good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast. We're really happy to be welcoming everyone to our webinar today, Inside the Dresner ADI Report, Why 100% of Customers Recommend Snowflake. My name is Ross Perez. I'm the Senior Director of Product Marketing here at Snowflake Computing. And later in this presentation, I'll be giving everyone a short description of our product and run through why we feel so many of our customers are positively recommending us. But before we do so, I wanted to introduce Bill Hostman from Dresner Advisory Services. He's a senior research fellow there, and he's going to run through a really interesting and detailed look at the Dresner ADI report, what it is, what it covers, and some of the findings that came out in the report this year. So with that, Bill, I'll turn it over to you, and thanks for joining us here this morning.
Great, thanks, Ross. Appreciate the introduction, and we're going to go through the report and give you some insights that we gleaned from thousands of folks giving us some overviews and insights into what we're calling an analytical data infrastructure. And analytical data infrastructure, is a lot different than what we used to think about in terms of data marts in many years gone past. And I'm going to go through a little bit of the definition, talk about the technologies in the market in transition, and get into a little bit more depth in terms of what we found out that what customers and buyers of analytic data infrastructures are really interested in. What are their priorities? And then also their feedback in terms of their vendor experiences. I also have some recommendations. I think this is a very, very complex market. I've been involved in this market for several years, starting with object-oriented databases, standalone object-oriented databases, and then was at Informix, which is now an IBM company, and then Informatica, and then I went to Gartner, and I was a analyst there for 15 years, covering the BI and analytics space. So I've seen this marketplace go through a lot of different transformations, and I think it's well worth it to sort of rethink our definitions and even our architectures associated around this thing that we're using to manage our data for these very, very complex BI and analytic use cases. So let me just do a little quick introduction about Analytic Dresner Advisory Services. It was founded in 2007 by Howard Dresner, who is also an ex-fellow from Gartner Research. It's basically an alternative. It's another view around business intelligence and related industry research. Howard and I, as well as the rest of the team, but amongst ourselves, we have over 100 years of collective industry experience, both on the user side, on the product development and product management, and customer experience side, as well as the research side of things. We have an independently defined research agenda. It's very transparent in terms of what our research, how we go about doing our research and our vendor rating process. It's a community-based and social media and crowdsourced set of surveys that is the source of our information. In other words, people we know, people who want to participate in this, and we get a very, very large sample size. Again, it's really user-driven, and its focus is on real-world perspective. We're not looking to, redefine things in 20 years. We're trying to help folks make decisions and understand what their priorities are for today and these most pressing decisions in some of these most complex areas. We have three basic, what we call Wisdom of Crowds flagship market studies. One is a BI Buyer's Guide edition, and we've got a 2018 one that's about ready to come out in June 15th, and it actually is bursting over into about 220 pages right now. And we also have a report on enterprise planning, and also we have the report we're going to be talking about today, the Analytic Data Infrastructure report. So, we've got a good body of both research analysts as well as research, and I'm real excited to give you some insight into the Analytical Data Infrastructure report today. So let's start with some definitions and some of the drivers that are really shaping this marketplace. So I like to start with architectures, and I think in terms of architectures, I'm an engineer. I think in terms of block diagrams. When we look at this, what we see is, we've had traditionally, the integration and prep stage of the data processing pipeline. We've had the model, manage, curate the data. We've seen more and more the rise of executing analytics right in the data management engine right next to the models. And then, the whole sort of access and publish. In other words, how do people consume this for the different use cases? And I put the circles in because, all of these things, the integration and prep, the model, curate, execute analytics, access and publish, all of these things change as the use case, as you give people information and they're looking to make decisions. The next thing is, okay, that's right. Okay, we need to change this. We change the process. We change the requirements on the data, and the data itself changes and the models change. So we have this continuous loop going around this cycle. And right now, what we have is, fairly discrete components in each one of these boxes. And I think we have to really think about, there's a whole host of vendors and technology, some complementary and some competitive, that are making up all the components of this. But this is the definition. This is not just about, a database. This is more about, let's think about the whole information processing pipeline going from the data sources. Let's look at the use cases. Let's look at the development and deployment options. And this is really the driving function behind our analytic data infrastructure report. A couple other things that I think are important is what's disrupt. Why are we thinking about it this way? Why are we taking this more holistic view about this? Or this is our attempt to take this more holistic view about this. Is there's a bunch of things that are going on at the macro level that are really disrupting this market in general. And I think one of the first one is the digital revolution. And I think, we've heard this word, we hear this word, a lot of us are in technology already, we hear this word, we get kind of maybe a little cynical about stuff like this. And, but I think this is, I've gone back and taken a look at some of the literature. And I think if you take a look at some of the digital transformation stats from the Worldwide Economic Forum and Accenture Analysis, you can go to the Worldwide Economic Forum website, they're calling this the fourth industrial revolution. And, digital connections with everyone, everything, everywhere, anytime. And as you can imagine, this is going to have a huge impact on our analytic data infrastructures. The whole notion of what a customer is and the types of analysis that we're doing, is rapidly changing. This is requiring investments to re-platform business applications and analytic data infrastructure. In fact, the Worldwide Economic Forum actually says corporate spending on emerging digital technologies is going to, which includes things like robotics, mobile, social, IoT, AI. They're forecasting that it's going to grow to about $2.4 trillion in 2020, up from $1.5 trillion in 2016. So that's a lot of spending on just these digital technologies, of which, the analytical data infrastructure is going to be a significant part. So that's like one of the major drivers and disruptors in this marketplace is, this is really truly a revolution. And it requires rethinking our business applications and re-platforming them to support this new revolution. The second market disruptor is really user evolution. So this is sort of in contrast to the notion of this sort of the digital revolution. This is really about user evolution. We've seen explosive growth of users and use cases. There's a multiplicity of user decisions being driven by analytics. There's different tools. We've all probably played this game called BI Bingo. You name the tool, and I'll tell you whether or not we have one or not. And you go through a list of 23 vendors, and you might find that you've got 11 or 12 of these tools consuming it on the user side. So that puts a lot of pressure back on the analytic data infrastructure. And I've seen this consistently. When I was at Informatica, I could forecast our revenue and our demand 2 quarters behind the business objects revenue. And it was very interesting. As the tools went out there, it placed more demand on the infrastructure. And so then they had to go out and buy and beef up their ETL tools, their data integration tools, and then they had to beef up their database. So there's this pendulum that I see that swings in the marketplace every 3 to 5 years, where it goes over to the user consumption side, and then it swings back into the data infrastructure side. And I think we're right in the middle of that swing right now. We've seen a very large saturation and availability of user tools out there in the marketplace. But what we're also seeing is the availability of user data is quite unsatisfactory. 47% of our survey respondents say that locating and accessing data needed for analysis is difficult, very difficult, or extremely difficult. Now, one of the things that you're going to see, I'm working on a report right now, a small report that we're doing around data catalogs, is that there's a direct relationship between those groups that say they have difficulty locating, accessing data, and the perceived success of those initiatives. It's a very, very high correlation rate. So we've got to solve this problem. It's a user evolution problem, which is they've got new tools, they've got new questions. It's always, the questions are changing. There's always a request for more data. We cannot have this situation where locating and accessing data, even though you may have the data infrastructure there, with 47%, you're not going to have a successful BI initiative. So there's this very strong correlation between, users being able to find and access the data and the success of the BI initiative. And that's really, we're calling that the user evolution, and the analytic data infrastructure needs to respond to that set of requirements. I think the third big driver here, and I think we're going to hear more about this, is these new governance and regulations on the horizon. Who gets to look at the data? When do they get to look at the data? What is your role in terms of accessing the information? Are you the provider of the information? Are you the consumer of the information? And there's all kinds of regulations going on and requirements that organizations, especially starting in the EU, this GDPR requirement that is going into effect this year, that's going to be significant. And you see a lot of companies start to line up behind that. If you ever have, so I think this is a really big issue that's going to have, I think, a big impact on, how organizations access and collaborate and share and govern information in their analytic data infrastructure. And I think we're seeing hearings in the EU, we're seeing hearings in the US, we're going to see more government legislation or regulations on the use and analysis of data. So I think, these are the three really big drivers that are having an impact on the market today. And speaking about the market, we have a lot of different logos. We have a competing and complementary mix of revolutionary and evolutionary vendors. They're addressing different parts of this marketplace. And it's not as simple as just, well, I've got a problem, which vendor is right for me. And we have to really look at a lot of different complex decision drivers around ADI priorities, from data sources and types to technology, the products and deployment, and what are the available developer skills. I mean, one of the biggest issues I've seen in my days as a product manager was, the question of, are there even skills out there to be able to support this new infrastructure that we have? Who's available? What's the scale? What's the security? What's the collaboration and governance? What's the ability to support agility when we have new requests for changes in the data? What are our deployment options? What are the standards that we should be supporting? What does our budget support? And what's our analytic use case? And we've gone out and we've looked at 4 analytic use cases. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to get into now a little bit of our results of looking at this market, these complex sets of priorities, and start to give you a little insight into our ADI report results. So on the technology side, here's a couple summary of the reports, and you're going to be able to have access to this report as a participant in this webinar. So I'm not going to go into all the details of the a couple hundred charts in there, but I'm going to summarize a key thing. One of the big things for me is that the way that people talk about those priorities on that previous slide, and the way that they rate the priority in terms of importance varies dramatically by the use case, the role and the function of the person you're asking in the organization, and the size of the organization. It's interesting that geography has a very, very small effect on those priorities, but use case, role and function, and size of the organization. I mean, in some cases, you'll see a stack of questions, a stack of answers around a particular question, and you'll see the answers from finance, and you'll see the answers from the BI team. And in some cases, they're exactly opposite priorities. So I think we've got some significant challenges in terms of understanding, how do we address the white spaces in an organization, especially when we have multiple use cases and multiple functions that we need to serve with this infrastructure. And one of my observations over the years is that as you increase the white spaces, on the org chart between those functions, the difficulty and the difficulty of success with that initiative goes up exponentially because you got politics involved, and that's a real challenge, and that's what we're seeing today. The highest priorities across the board today are for performance. Everybody's looking for scale. They want performance and they want security, and that makes sense because we've got all these new use cases that are demanding, performance on the data. And then we've got to also address this other issue of security. But those are the top two across the board, all regions, all roles, functions, size of organizations. So that's one that's really important. Interesting to note that in 2017 report, usability was was one of the top selection priorities, but now it's actually switched to security. I think that's in preface for things like those regulatory requirements that we talked about earlier, as well as some high-profile break-ins that have occurred on some of these analytic data infrastructures. The lowest priorities, which I found to be very, very interesting, is price and corporate standard. Corporate standard was the absolute lowest. So it appears that everybody's willing to break the mold. If they think that they can get their analytic use case priorities met and be successful by swimming against the corporate standard, they're doing that. And I thought it was interesting also, price was the second lowest and corporate standard was the lowest. So, people are willing to reinvest. They're willing to, address and invest in their ADI platforms because they know that those drivers that we talked about up front are very, very real and they're key. And you can't get left behind on those things. And so price becomes a secondary issue. And I just think corporate standard means, kind of back to that first issue up there, the priorities vary by use case, role, function, and size of organization. So it's hard to, get a common view of what the right solution should look like. And I think that should be a key role for everyone that's leading a BI or an analytic initiative is, where are our priorities? Where's the center of gravity of our information to be successful with those priorities for that use case. I'm going to go into that a little bit more in our recommendations a little bit further on here in the slides. Development and deployment, scale up and scale out capabilities, clustering, load balancing, high availability, et cetera. Those are the top criteria, as well as data lifecycle management, things like lineage, impact analysis, metadata, and governance. So we're starting to see, coupled up with security, those data lifecycle management functions are really leading in terms of responses around development and deployment feature priorities. Again, these charts and all the details behind these are available in the report. On-premises deployments are only leading slightly today in priority over cloud deployments. Cloud deployments, I think, are soon going to eclipse the on-premise deployments. We're seeing a lot more move. And it's interesting, it's also by function in the organization. You can see, as you look at the report, you'll see that the preferences for cloud has different functions inside the organization, and other organizations prioritize it very, very low. So, another thing to consider very carefully. Analytic features, we're not starting, but use of R, machine learning, MapReduce, and Spark show the largest year-over-year increases in terms of, ADI analytic features and priorities. Data types, transactional data is still the top data priority across the board. For all ADI platforms and all verticals and all use cases, followed by metadata, which warms my heart because we all know the value of metadata. Text and machine log, images and data types for also increase in year-over-year priority for ADI platforms. In terms of the data prep and load side of things, ETL and bulk load transformation still leads data preparation and loading priorities again this year, but all other data preparation and loading capabilities increase in importance year over year, especially things like self-service, where, again, we've got a lot of end users out there that have their own tools. They want to be able to get that data into a form that makes most sense for their application. So, a lot of activity there, but still, when we look at the ADI technology priorities, it's still, high speed, updating, and the bulk loading and transformation still lead those priorities. Now on this slide we asked the respondents, what is your use case? What's the most important use case for your analytic data infrastructure? And the bottom is the highest rank, and then we go to the lower rank. Business user reporting and dashboards, still, the highest, use case, highest priority or highest interest use case, and followed by business user discovery and exploration. So it fits with our classic, model of more users, new users, and a lot more discovery and exploration. Still driving the ADI use cases. And then we've got data. You can see these numbers here about data science, which we consider to be advanced in predictive analytics and data mining, and then embedded analytics within the business applications. In other words, high volume and low latency. Now, if we look at the year-over-year trending on this, we see some, potentially interesting trends going on here in terms of shifting priorities. We're starting to see more of a shift towards, the embedded analytics within the business applications, as well as the data science applications. Now, these are not, huge shifts, but they're things that I think we can all sort of experience, and we've seen them ourselves. And it's just kind of interesting to see the data, right here, that as we move towards more of the, replatforming our business to support that digital enterprise, that means we have to move the analytics closer to those applications. And so we're seeing a lot of interest around embedded analytics within the business applications themselves. And I think, that coupled up with data science doing the advanced analytics is a trend that we're going to continue to see in the next 3 to 5 years. Now, just a couple of examples of some of the data in the report. Again, here's sort of the detail on this. What we do is we look at the data from multiple dimensions, and this is an example of one of the graphs that you'll see in the report. We ask the question, what is your priority for, based on a scale of 1 to 5 for these different data types. And this is, you can see we break it down by use case, but this is a great example of, if we just take a look at the dimension by use case, we see that it varies across the board. You ask, something like text analytics, that's very, very high priority in terms of embedded analytics. And yet, if you look at, some of the other use cases, it may not be as high. So just some interesting things to take a look at, really looking at the lens of the use case and looking at the different sort of priorities is a great way to understand, how to go about really understanding what your own priorities might be as you're making those decisions about your ADI architecture and infrastructure. SQL data, still, highest data model that everybody's looking for. It's, very vanilla. Everybody, it's very common across the board. But you can see, again, as you get into use cases, you get quite a bit of variability in terms of priorities, based on the use cases. Again, these are all graphs that are in the chart. I won't bore you with there. I've got my narrative all written up in the report, which you guys all will have access to. ADI interfaces, again, by top use cases, varies significantly. Again, just some examples, but ODBC, web services, Excel, CSV. I mean, people still want that web RESTful, very, very high, especially in the area of business user discovery and exploration. I think it's also interesting. Well, I think the MDX one is kind of an interesting one, the high spike there. But again, I've got a narrative on that in the report. I encourage you to take a look at that. But again, very significantly, the priorities vary significantly by use case. And I think it's real important that we start to look at, our priorities by use cases as we're making our buying and our architecture decisions. Licensing preferences, again, vary significantly. And if you ask this question by function, you get really interesting responses with a lot of variability to them as well. Subscription, classic, right, for embedded analytics within business applications. We're starting to see more, more interest in terms of computing resources type licensing. We're seeing a lot more variability in terms of interest in licensing, from the perpetual licensing model. But this is an area that also there's a fair amount of interest in terms of open source technology. There's a fairly active community out there. And I think that's going to be an area to definitely keep our eyes on going forward. So let's talk a little bit about the market itself. We have two basic ratings that we look at. We have what we call a customer experience model, and we have a vendor credibility model. And we look at several different measures. We look at things like sales experience from the customer's perspective, value for price, quality and usefulness of product, quality of technical support, quality of consulting services, the integrity of the vendor. Did they deliver what they say? Whether the vendor is recommended or not, whether they would recommend it to their peers. And then we break those out into these two charts. You can see product and technology, sales and service, and we rank the different vendors that we're currently watching. We look at who's really getting traction in the marketplace, and where's the demand, and where are people responding to our surveys. I mean, these are your responses, and then we use those to plot them on the graph, and you can see the market here, and it's interesting because it really speaks to the changing market dynamics, right? The sort of tried and true data infrastructure providers, the Oracles, the SAPs, the IBMs, and even the Microsoft, are getting eclipsed somewhat by some of the newer entrants, at least on the sort of perception and customer experience. Google, Amazon, Cloudera, and then you got Snowflake up in that upper right doing extremely positive well on sales and service and product and technology responses. So again, a market in transition to meet those changing dynamics and drivers that we see going on there. In terms of vendor rating credibility, here we're looking at things like the experience, the relationship with the sales teams, and you can see again, a lot of the traditional vendors, this is where they're having a difficult time. They're not keeping up with the changes in the market and those drivers we talked about, or they're just overly complicated. And so people are looking for alternatives, and we're seeing a credibility shift in the marketplace. And so this is a fairly strong dynamic that I'm seeing in the marketplace. Again, as I said, I've been studying this marketplace and working in this marketplace for a long time. And we would have probably all thought, oh, it's all done. Everybody sorted it out. We've got our winners, and we've got who's going to be there for the next whatever number of years. And it's right now undergoing changes, and it's a significant number of changes. And this is sort of a snapshot in terms of credibility, and as you see, a lot of the non-incumbents, the folks like Snowflake and Exasol rank very, very highly. Amazon, Google ranking very highly, and a lot of the traditional vendors not doing so well. Again, all the reports, all of the measures, and the scores for particularly Snowflake are in the report that you'll all have access to. So what are some recommendations? I mean, what are sort of I would hate to dump everybody with a bunch of data and then just run off and leave you with a thank you. But before I turn it over to Ross, let me just leave you with a couple of recommendations. And I think the key thing, if I was an architect today, I really think we've got to answer the question, which is where are the centers of gravity of our data? And I think we've got to think about, is it customers? Is it financial? Is it operational data? Is it all about just, standalone analysis? Or what's really driving those priorities that allow us to start to think about, the centers of gravity of our data? Is it about tightly coupling the analytics within the operational applications? And do we really look at those priorities and evaluate vendors about integrating with applications? Or is it something about more of a looser coupling, where I have more data integration and preparation involved, and I get federation and virtualization? We all probably know the pros and cons of federation and virtualization, although that has become much better in the last couple of years. Or do we go with just standalone, analytic data infrastructures for very specific tools that, are use case specific? So, or are they serving multiple use cases? So I think it's really important that we kind of start to think, what's our center of gravity of our data? Is it the customers? Is it our manufacturing data? And then I think that's a really good way to start to break out the architecture that's going to best meet those priorities. A couple other things. So we've got to define these analytical centers of gravity with a goal of data scale and security, right back to that original issue that is the #1 top priority across the board overall worldwide. We got to think about where are these centers of gravity? How do we get that data scale and security? And I think it's important, every time you talk about either a revolutionary change or an evolutionary change, we've got to explain what the value is. And so we've got to really map the value of data and analytics investments, including the analytic data infrastructure, which a lot of people don't really think about, those business outcomes and objectives. I know we all talk about this, but I think this right now, when we're seeing this kind of shift in the marketplace, these kinds of drivers at the macro level in terms of economics, we have to really kind of rethink, go back and revisit those business objectives and make sure we're doing the right thing in terms of building out our analytic data infrastructure to match those business objectives. I think you got to assess the current use case satisfaction with analytical data in terms of the, I call this the track metrics, but timeliness. Is the timeliness of the information good enough? The relevance, is it good enough? Is the accuracy good enough? Consistency, skills. Survey those folks and figure out, are you hitting the value and are you delivering the value required to meet those business objectives? And as you realize from the survey results we've been talking about, those business objectives are very functional and specific within the organization. And so you're going to have to really understand how to create those centers of gravity. And I think this value map will help quite a bit. And I think you have to assess the ROI. I mean, this is a big change inside of a lot of organizations in terms of skills, investments. But I think it's really important to assess the ROI and strategy of changing your data analytics centers of gravity and ask yourself, are we an evolution change or are we making a revolution change? Based on the answers to that, I've kind of put together a couple of ways to think about priorities and looking at vendors, and really just sort of distilling down some of the key priorities in the report. If you're looking at that digital revolution, if you're really thinking about replatforming your business to get the high scale data analytics, coupled with artificial intelligence, machine learning, where you've got analytics right there in the infrastructure, at the sort of low latency level. I think it's important to rethink about, the development and deployment options for replatforming. How hard is it going to be to do that replatform? What's the product integrity? And more importantly, because this is still changing, what's the product agility? How easy is it for us to make changes? How easy is it for us to respond to those new use cases with this digital revolution and ripple that through that infrastructure? If your focus is on evolution, where I'm really looking to increase the value of multiple analytical use cases, you got to look at that analytic data infrastructure from the perspective of what's its ease of use? What are the data integration and data prep, and how do I make this thing more consumable to address that issue of it's really hard for me to find the data? Because we know that if the answer to that question is, the information is not timely, it's not relevant, it's not accurate, and it's difficult to find it, you're not going to be a successful BI initiative. We really got to look at that ease of use. We've got to look at data integration. We've got to look at end user data prep. I think we also got to look at collaboration and sharing functions. How can we go about both balancing governance with collaboration to make that ease of use more possible? Again, you don't want to be in that 46% of the people saying it's hard for these users or any users to look at that information. Governance, I would be remiss if I didn't offer a recommendation on governance. I think it's going to be really important. But look at the security. How does it integrate with your current security infrastructure? How do you define user groups and access controls? Another priority I think is extremely important that addresses that issue about data finding the data is data catalogs. It's an emerging area that a lot of vendors from a lot of different places are coming online with to be able to support questions from the end users about where do I find this data? How do I secure this data? Who gets to look at this data by user groups? So I think this is going to come up, data catalogs and use of data catalogs in governance as we start to address those GDPR requirements. And then that couples up with, how well does the analytic data infrastructure support, the ability to track metadata and lineage. So I've gone through a whole lot of stuff, but I really appreciate your interest. I encourage you, take a look at that analytic data infrastructure report, that full report. I've given you a couple of insights that we think are important to consider in terms of drivers of analytic data infrastructure, the changing dynamics and definitions in the marketplace, as well as some recommendations. And we want to make sure that you're not in that 46% of the folks that are difficult and failing in their BI success initiatives. We want to make you the successful teams. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ross.
Thank you, Bill, and really appreciate that detailed, in-depth look at the ADI and the findings that you guys came out with. And so what I'm going to do now is describe a little bit about not just where we landed in the ADI report, but more importantly, why we think we landed in that place and how we look at our customer experience, and a little bit about the Snowflake product as well. Now, as Bill has already discussed, you've already seen the vendor credibility model, the customer experience model, so I won't go into those. Obviously, Snowflake ranked exceptionally well in both of these models, and we're very happy to have participated. And the thing that I think is most important here is that Dresner has created a fantastic framework for these studies that is about what the customers have actually said in their surveys. So this isn't, guided by any of the feelings of analysts or anything like that. This is something that is showing what the actual customer experience is, and we just think that the methodology that Dresner has is really superior in a lot of ways because of that. Now, from the Snowflake side, you may be wondering, well, what does Snowflake care about? Why do customers rate Snowflake so positively when they are responding to this Dresner survey? Well, I think if you look at our values, and of course many companies have values, but the number one value that we have is putting customers first, and if you look not just at the way that we do business as a company, but if you look at the way the product is created, it really is built in a way that is meant to be customer friendly. And one of the most obvious ways that you can point out in this, in our model and how we do business, is the way that we charge our customers. Traditionally, with data warehouses and with other infrastructure that people may use for analytics, you pay the vendor up front for a fixed size data warehouse. So we're purchasing a data warehouse of X number of nodes, and that's what we'll be using. But whether or not you get value from that product is up in the air. You may not even implement it. You may actually not even be able to implement the product and see success with it. Even if you look at the cloud, you can see a lot of products where you purchase a fixed size, and you may not use all of the size, all of the capacity that you've purchased from that vendor. The difference with Snowflake is whatever you're purchasing, we only get paid as a company when you actually use the product. And it's a huge difference between not only the traditional vendors, but also the cloud-based data warehouses that you may be familiar with. So I think that above all is definitely a very good starting place. But of course, the product itself is very important as well. And when we went to build the product, one of the things that we noticed was exactly what Bill pointed out in one of his slides in the report, which is that SQL is the language of data. So Snowflake was created as a SQL analytical data warehouse. That's the problem that it's meant to solve. And when you look at the responses in the Dresner ADI report, you see that as people use Snowflake for these types of workloads, they are experiencing the positive attributes of a data warehouse that's built to use the language that people are already familiar with using, and that is meant to facilitate analytics as a process. And For those of you who aren't familiar with Snowflake as a product, I'm going to briefly kind of describe what we've built beyond the fact that, of course, it's an analytical SQL data warehouse. Many of the people that we talk to, the prospects we talk to in the market who aren't familiar with Snowflake yet, they have some pretty straightforward goals for their data warehouse and for their databases that they're using for analytics. First of all, easy management. They want to be able to basically have the database run itself. They want to put all of their data in one system and get rid of the silos that they're dealing with for different types of data and for different organizations within their team. They want to scale on demand, go up and down with capacity as they need to. And of course, like I said, using standard SQL. Unfortunately, current technologies don't really support this type of experience. Management of the database often requires a dedicated team. People are having to have multiple silos to house semi-structured and structured data, or perhaps they have multiple silos for different parts of the organization. Marketing might have a different silo, sales might have a different silo. And scaling, even with cloud technologies, can be really a difficult task to do. You have to shut down the database, resize, repartition, and then restart it once you've resized. Of course, this isn't a very great way to actually scale on demand. It's not on demand. It's actually a lot of effort to scale. And for standard skills, many companies are noticing that they're not able to use their standard skills, particularly if they're using NoSQL or Hadoop systems. So one of our customers, Kixeye, they said it like this. Previously, it took more than 2 hours from the time the data arrived to the time that it was fully queryable, and that just wasn't timely. Well, why was this? Well, if you look at the problems that I just discussed, they were running into all of these issues with their existing tools. Their team was spending too much time turning knobs and trying to manage the database. They couldn't host JSON in their standard data warehouse, so they had to have multiple systems. They had to buy a Hadoop system in order to store their semi-structured data. And they needed to be able to handle an influx of data that may change at any given time. And of course, their users wanted to be able to manage and use their data warehouse and their Hadoop systems, but they didn't necessarily have the skills to go and address this. Now, obviously, those problems couldn't be fixed with traditional architecture. So with Snowflake, what we've actually gone and looked to do is deliver a data warehouse that addresses the needs of a modern organization for easy management, storing their data in one place, scaling on demand, and using standard skills. But to do that, we have had to go and build an entirely new architecture for data warehousing in the cloud. We start with flexible cloud storage that enables us to store both semi-structured and structured data in the same database. You may be asking, well, how does Snowflake store semi-structured data? Well, we actually have a column type, a variant column type that you can use to store semi-structured data in its native format. This means that you don't have to flatten the data or define a schema before you load the data. You can load it in its native format, and then you can use dot notation with standard SQL to interact with that data as you go forward. Around this flexible cloud storage, we have what we call virtual warehouses, which are simply compute clusters that you can spin up at any given time for any different need. The difference here between Snowflake and the traditional architectures that you may be familiar with is that it's a multi-cluster system. This means that you can have complete workload isolation between the different groups or teams in your organization, while at the same time referencing the same single source of the truth in the data that you've stored within Snowflake. And of course, at any time, you can turn off any one of these virtual warehouses, these compute clusters, if you're not using it. On top of this, we have the database services that run and manage Snowflake for you. So it's a data warehouse in the sense that you're familiar with, and you can use it just like you're using any of the traditional data warehouses that you're already using today. But Snowflake is a service, so we manage all of the optimization and tuning and security and availability and transactions for you so that you don't need to worry about it. Well, what's the upside? What's the impact? Where are you actually going to be with Snowflake? And why are Snowflake customers so positive about the technology? Well, because of the impact that Snowflake can have on these organizations. So at Kixeye, they were able to deliver easy management by eliminating the silos and tuning and optimization that the team needed to cover before. Because they can store JSON within Snowflake, they eliminated a silo that they had within their organization. They have all of their data in one easy-to-use place. Of course, with Snowflake's virtual warehouses, they can scale on demand up and down as needed. They can isolate their workloads for the different teams. They can, of course, store as much data as they need to as well, because it's not just about compute. It's also about the amount of data that you're storing. And of course, last, they're able to standardize on SQL, the language of data, for all of their internal customers who needed to analyze data. It's not just one customer, though. Snowflake is absolutely, the enterprise standard with 1,000+ customers that have chosen to use us, from small customers to very large Fortune 500 organizations. They are all taking advantage of and using Snowflake, and these are the customers that are responding to the Dresner ADI report and noting their experience with us. So with that, we've gone about 45 minutes into the webinar, and I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions. So I'm going to open it up for Q&A, and I'm going to actually take a look at the questions that have come in. If you have a question for us, please do submit it. You'll notice on your screen there's a blue bar at the bottom of your screen. You can click the Q&A button and submit any questions that you may have to us. All right, so I'm going to take a look at the ones that have already rolled in. So this is a good question. So how do you handle multi-hybrid cloud data silo analysis? Well, on the Snowflake side, the system is entirely in the cloud. So we're not hybrid cloud in the sense that you could use or host Snowflake in a hybrid cloud, because we host it for you. But you could certainly use Snowflake as a tool for bringing data together from multiple places. In fact, we have a tool called Snowpipe that enables you to ingest streaming data if you need to, and of course we can load data from multiple cloud environments. So if you have data in Azure, we can load data from there directly into Snowflake. Same thing for AWS. And then, there's a lot of flexibility with the data that you're actually analyzing with our tool. This one is a good one for Bill. Can you explain what you mean by data center of gravity a little bit more?
Sure. I did a little bit of explanation, but I can expand on that a little bit more. I think as we start to see business applications embed analytics closer and closer to the business applications themselves and embed them there. I think one of the key questions we're going to ask is the center of gravity for the analytics going to be, in the business applications themselves, or is it going to be standalone from the business applications? In other words, let's take a CRM application that has built-in, packaged applications. The center of gravity of that is going to be customer. And, is that the right way to be looking at your business? And that is a center of gravity. And should I, just take that vendor's reports and analysis, which may be very appropriate, but how much do they reflect my business objectives? And so is my center of gravity going to be the business applications and report associated with that, or is it going to be a standalone infrastructure? And then the second part of that is customer really the way that we want to be looking at our business, or should we be looking at our supply chain view or our operational view and manufacturing view? What is the way to be able to look at that and then combine that with the use case requirements? And so those three things really define what I talk about as the center of gravity of data. And I think it's real important to take that concept and start to think about it, because we're going to be pulling that center of gravity in a lot of different directions given all the changes in the marketplace.
Awesome. Thank you, Bill. Here's the next question. Healthcare organizations are paranoid about using anything that has the word cloud in it. How do you convince them to try a POC? Any examples of healthcare organizations that are using Snowflake? Well, the answer is absolutely. And I think I'll go into a little bit about how we work with customers who have sensitive data, but I would expand this to financial services, to insurance. There are so many industries that are really concerned about cloud. So I would say, though, that of the leaders in the space, you look at companies like Capital One, who are leading the way to the cloud and obviously have significant concerns about their customers' data. A lot of things that they've been finding and been talking about is that the cloud is, in many ways, actually a more secure environment for data. Just looking at the advantages of size, as AWS has grown, their implementation of the cloud and their infrastructure that's available to their customers, their ability to support a vast and really comprehensive suite of security tools and systems grows as well. And Snowflake takes advantage of all of that on top of AWS. So a great example is customers who want to use Private Link, which enables them to connect to Snowflake without going over the public internet. That eliminates one enormous concern that many organizations may have with the cloud. And you can also look at other tools like Direct Connect, which is actually a hard line into their organization that, again, deals with the concern about traffic going over the internet. Now, you can also see a lot of intelligence in the way that Snowflake is architected with respect to encryption. So depending on which version you purchase of Snowflake, you can purchase a version that has data that's encrypted all the time, whether it's at rest or in transit. And we also have a version of Snowflake called Virtual Private Snowflake, which enables you to be completely isolated in your own instance of the product. I'm talking quite a bit here, but the basic upshot is that depending on what the level of security concerns is for any given organization, there are many solutions that Snowflake offers to help them address that. And so I think it's so important for solutions providers, particularly, to be asking questions. What is the goal? Not whether or not they are willing to move to the cloud, but what are their objectives for security, and what tools can we use in the cloud to be able to help assuage that? But also to be pointing out that there are so many more people devoted to security and to the protection of sensitive data in the cloud than any single individual or organization could be able to devote on their own. So the advantages of size are enormous with the cloud, and I think we should take advantage of that. Okay, so we're kind of running low on time. I'll take one more question here. And so that question is, I assume that Snowflake only provides database infrastructure. Customers have to design their specific models and write ETL code, right? Well, that is true in a way. So Snowflake is the database infrastructure, but we actually have very close integrations with multiple ETL vendors that can help you to avoid having to do the ETL code on your own. So if you look at companies like Illuma, Fivetran, Informatica, Talend, even Alteryx, which admittedly has a slightly different viewpoint on this type of thing. We work with the tools that people are using to massage and arrange and organize their data into a way that really makes sense, and bring it into Snowflake in a way that is really straightforward and easy for the customer to implement. So I wouldn't suggest to anybody to go out and write the ETL code themselves, although you most certainly can. We do have a Python driver that's very useful if you do wish to do so. But I would look to the partner ecosystem that is really well developed at Snowflake and is a great reason why many of our customers are so happy with using the services, not just because of Snowflake, but because of our great partners, including the ones I mentioned in AWS, Tableau, and of course Looker. So the partner ecosystem can help with a lot of the things that you just discussed. With that, I'll bring our webinar to a close here, and I just want to reiterate our appreciation for you tuning in. And if you haven't had the opportunity, please do give Snowflake a try. There are links within the webinar platform that you should be able to click to be able to make use of Snowflake and take advantage of $400 in free credit that we give to anyone who wants to give it a try. Again, thanks for your time today, and that's all from us.